They sat me in the back, near the brooms and broken boxes, as if I didn't matter. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just part of the family business, I was the reason it was still alive. There are many ways to be erased, but few are as sharp and cold as being made invisible in plain sight. To be present, but unacknowledged, to exist within the walls of your family's legacy, yet treated like an outsider who wandered in uninvited. The pain of rejection doesn't always come from loud words or overt hostility. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest gestures, the subtle seating choices, the way eyes pass over you, the manner in which no one makes space for your presence. To matter, it begins where you are placed, not just physically but symbolically. A chair in a forgotten corner, a table out of view, a space near the back, where function replaces dignity. These details may seem logistical to others, but to the one who sits in that space, they become declarations. Declarations that say, you are not needed here. You are not important. You are not one of us. Not really. Not in the way that counts. The moment you are seated away from the table, away from the conversation, away from the center, you learn exactly where you stand. It's never said directly. No one needs to say it. The message is delivered in the posture of the room, in the way chairs are filled before yours is considered, in the way your input is not requested, anticipated, or remembered. It is a deliberate forgetting not of your face, but of your value. This kind of treatment doesn't land without history. It's rarely the first time. It is the most recent chapter in a long pattern of being overlooked, dismissed, miscast. The storage room seat is not just about that day, it is about every moment before it that taught you to shrink so that others could feel larger. It is the result of years of being present without being seen, contributing without being counted, serving without being thanked. And the storage room itself becomes a metaphor, not just a place where unwanted items are placed, but a space where things go to be out of the way, where value is assumed to be absent, where no one expects brilliance, or strength or leadership to reside. The storage room is where things are stored, not celebrated, and being placed there says more than anyone dares admit out loud. In that seat, you begin to remember all the times your voice was interrupted or ignored, all the moments your efforts were rebranded under someone else's name, all the occasions where you were told to wait your turn, to be patient, to be grateful just to be included, even if inclusion looked like exclusion dressed up as courtesy. You remember the long hours of dedication, the quiet work done behind the scenes, the loyalty that went unnoticed because it didn't come with ego or performance. Sitting in that room is not about space, it's about status. It's about being told wordlessly, efficiently that you do not belong where decisions are made, that your presence is tolerable so long as it remains small, that recognition is reserved for those who speak louder, demand more, and take up space without permission. You realize that your humility has been mistaken for weakness, your patience for passivity, your silence for insignificance. You begin to observe the ones seated at the table, how confidently they speak, how freely they assume control, how naturally they accept power as their birthright, and you realize they have never once feared being seen. They have never questioned whether they were allowed to belong. They were raised to expect it, taught that their presence was not only welcome but necessary. They were never sent to the storage room because they never had to prove they didn't belong there. There's a particular pain in being disregarded by your own. When strangers fail to see you, it hurts. But when family does it, it confirms your deepest fears. It reopens every wound that once convinced you that your worth was conditional. It tells you that no matter how much you contribute, you will never be enough in their eyes. Not because you haven't earned it, but because they have decided not to look. That moment is more than embarrassment. It is revelation. It shows you how they define value, not by contribution, but by performance. Not by impact, but by visibility. And because you never asked for the spotlight, they assumed you didn't deserve to be on the stage. Because you never demanded credit, they believed you hadn't earned any. Because you never fought for power, they believed you didn't have it. You begin to recognize the systems within the family dynamic, who holds influence, who follows, who stays silent, and who is always expected to absorb disrespect without making waves. You see the informal hierarchies, whose ideas are praised before they're fully formed, and whose are dismissed before they're even heard. You see how legacy is not passed down, it's seized by those who believe they own it. The storage room is not accidental, it is strategic. It removes you from the circle of trust. It shields others from having to confront your competence. It keeps you close enough to remain useful, but distant enough to remain invisible. You become a utility, a helper, a name on an email, a silent attendee. You are not asked what you think. You are not asked what you know. You are not even asked if you want to be there. You are placed, not welcomed. And still, you sit. Because dignity doesn't require recognition. Because your presence is not performative. Because your worth is not dependent on their arrangement. Because even in that back corner, you carry something they don't see: clarity. And that clarity sharpens as the meeting progresses. It shapes into understanding. Understanding that this room, this dynamic, this family system, was never designed for you to lead. Not because you aren't capable, but because your strength doesn't serve their image of control. The humbling part isn't where you're seated. It's realizing how long you accepted that seat without question. How often you showed up hoping someone would invite you to the table. How deeply you believed that, if you worked hard enough, stayed loyal enough, kept quiet enough, you would be seen. That the invitation would eventually come. But it didn't, and maybe it never will. And maybe that's okay. Because in that moment, you stop waiting. You stop hoping to be moved forward. You stop shrinking to fit their structures. You start to realize that the seat doesn't determine your power. Their recognition doesn't decide your relevance. Their silence doesn't erase your voice. Their dismissal doesn't nullify your work. You are not their position to grant. You are not their rank to define. You are your own proof, and you no longer need permission to exist in your fullness. The storage room becomes the moment you remember who you are, not who they've treated you as, but who you've become in spite of it. You remember the long nights you stayed up keeping the business running while they slept. The weekends you poured into fixing what others broke. The patience you showed when others cut corners. The competence you never paraded because you didn't need applause to do what was right. You remember that power is not always loud. It is often held by those who watch, who learn, who wait. Those who understand that leadership is not about dominance, but about vision. Those who know that one day, the table will shift. And when it does, the ones who dismissed you will realize they were never looking low enough to see where the real strength was held. Visibility is not the same as value. It's easy to confuse the two, especially in environments where recognition is currency and volume is mistaken for impact. But there is a different kind of work, the kind that happens away from attention, without applause, without ceremony. It's the quiet labor of someone who doesn't need validation to keep showing up, someone who doesn't broadcast their usefulness because their loyalty speaks louder than their words. Invisible effort isn't measured by titles or seating arrangements. It's built in the hours no one counts, the tasks no one claims, the problems solved before they were even noticed. It's the consistency that holds everything together when others forget what needs holding. It's the early mornings and late nights that aren't captured in reports or remembered in meetings. It's the reliability that becomes so expected, it vanishes into the background until the moment it's gone. To be the invisible pillar of something is to live in contradiction. You are both essential and ignored. Everything you do matters deeply, yet is rarely acknowledged. Your presence is assumed, your contribution is expected, and your absence is only felt when things fall apart. You are the contingency plan, the fixer, the one who understands systems so well that your efficiency makes it look easy. And because it looks easy, it is underestimated. Every system needs a quiet engine. Someone behind the scenes who anticipates, prepares, adjusts, who notices the cracks before they spread, who doesn't need credit, but deserves it. That was the role, not by choice, but by necessity. Not because the spotlight was unwanted, but because the work needed doing, and there was no time to wait for recognition. The success of the business depended on 1,000 unseen decisions, each made without fanfare. There is no glamour in invisible effort. It's repetitive, exhausting, often thankless. It's answering the same questions, solving the same issues, protecting others from consequences they never even see. It's sitting in meetings where your ideas are echoed by louder voices and credited elsewhere. It's offering support without strings, giving more than is fair, and hoping that at some point, someone might notice that the weight was never shared equally. It's balancing numbers after everyone's gone home. It's organizing what others disorganize. It's smoothing over what others disrupt. It's carrying institutional memory in your mind, not because you were asked to, but because someone had to. It's being the one who remembers deadlines, policies, names, and histories. It's being the one others come to when they're stuck, even though they won't admit how often you're their solution. But invisibility takes a toll, not immediately, not in ways others can see. It shows up in the quiet frustration when your expertise is questioned by those who rely on it. It lives in the fatigue of doing twice the work for half the credit. It builds into resentment, not because of the labor itself, but because of how it's dismissed. Over time, you begin to wonder if silence was a mistake, if humility only made it easier for others to overlook your value. There's a cost to being indispensable and unnoticed. You become a resource, not a person. Your reliability is no longer respected, it's consumed. Your willingness to do what others won't becomes a trap. The more you give, the more is taken. And because you never complained, the assumption grows. You're fine, you're available, you're willing, you'll handle it. You always do. The work became a pattern. Fixing things before they broke. Managing what others forgot. Learning the business in ways that no one taught you, through trial and necessity. Understanding the systems better than the ones who inherited them. Doing more with less. Bridging gaps between departments, between people. Being the connective tissue in a structure that was too fragmented to function without someone silently holding it all together. There were countless times when others took credit, whether consciously or not. Times when your suggestions were repeated by someone else, more loudly, and applauded. Times when your ideas became part of the company's progress, but your name never did. Times when your insight saved a deal, fixed a process, retained a client, but the thanks went elsewhere. The success was always collective, but the failures somehow became yours alone. And yet, you stayed, not because you didn't see it, but because walking away from something you built is not as easy as it seems. You stayed because you believed in the work, in the potential, in the idea that maybe, someday, it would be different. You stayed because responsibility was a reflex, not a choice. Because care was not a performance, but a principle. Because even when no one saw you, you still saw the impact. You saw the difference it made when you handled the numbers correctly, when you trained the new hire with care, when you followed up on details others forgot. You saw how the rhythm of the business flowed smoother because you anticipated the disruptions. You knew which client needed extra attention, which department was quietly falling behind, which system was on the edge of breaking, and you fixed it without asking for applause. But being unseen for long enough changes you. It erodes your trust in others. It makes you question whether people truly value competence or just confidence, whether loyalty is rewarded or simply exploited, whether people really see character or just charisma. It begins to hurt, not because you crave the spotlight, but because you no longer want to be taken for granted. There's a loneliness in being necessary but unacknowledged. It isolates you. It creates a wall between you and the rest of the team, the family, the leadership. You start to feel like a ghost in your own work. Present, involved, but not invited. Everything you do matters, just not in ways others are willing to recognize. And slowly, that realization builds into something unshakable. You can't keep giving to people who treat your silence as surrender. What made the efforts invisible wasn't the work itself, it was the people who chose not to see. Who benefited from your commitment but never returned it. Who leaned on your consistency but never questioned how heavy it was to carry so much alone. Who praised themselves for results you made possible. Who treated your presence like a given, never a gift. Reaching the point of acknowledgement wasn't about being praised, it was about being respected. It wasn't about attention, it was about accuracy. About truth, about fairness. About being recognized as a cornerstone, not a convenient shadow. It wasn't about ego. It was about balance. It was about finally stepping into your rightful place in the story. Not as a footnote, but as a foundation. That quiet labor had built something strong, not just a business, but a legacy of endurance, of care, of principle. You had weathered storms they never even saw coming. You had caught errors before they became crises. You had prepared paths others now walked with ease. And though they never gave you credit, the evidence was everywhere. In the growth, in the systems, in the stability they now assumed was natural. Your efforts were never invisible because they were small, they were invisible because others refused to look beyond themselves. But that doesn't make them any less real. And in time, the truth has a way of surfacing, not because you demand it, but because you've made yourself undeniable. Your impact speaks louder than their silence ever could. Being overlooked is rarely a sudden event. It is a slow shaping, a quiet conditioning that begins long before you can name it. It starts with small dismissals, tiny recalibrations of who you're allowed to be. It grows in the spaces where your voice was first talked over, where your ideas were first met with silence. where your presence was tolerated but never celebrated. Being overlooked is not just about being ignored in the moment. It is about being trained to expect less from people who claim to love you. The history of being overlooked begins with the role you are given in the story of others. The role is not chosen, it is assigned. Sometimes it is the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who never asks for much. Sometimes it's the background support, the buffer, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the one who's there to absorb tension, smooth over conflict, do the work no one wants to do. It is a role that seems harmless at first, even admirable. But over time, it becomes a cage. That role becomes invisible because it becomes expected. When you do something over and over without needing praise, people stop seeing it as effort. They see it as personality. When you are the one who never causes problems, you become the one who doesn't need attention. When you're the one who always figures things out, you become the one no one offers help to. When your strength becomes your norm, others stop seeing it as strength, they see it as default, and so the cycle continues. You give more because it's who you are. They take more because they believe you'll never break. You shrink yourself because speaking up feels like betrayal. They grow louder because your silence creates space. You ask for less because you've learned that needs are inconvenient. They expect more because you've taught them that you will never say no. It's a pattern of mutual misunderstanding, but only one side pays the cost. Being overlooked is not always cruel. Sometimes it's quiet neglect, the kind that doesn't wound openly but leaves bruises on your sense of self. It's the missed opportunities, the promotions you weren't considered for, the family decisions made without your input. It's the times you were told to wait your turn, and the turn never came. It's the way you became known for your reliability, not your brilliance, for your loyalty, not your leadership. And over time, that history writes itself into your body. You start to sit smaller in rooms. You speak less, even when you have something to say. You hesitate before suggesting an idea, already anticipating dismissal. You question your own insight before anyone else gets the chance to. You do the work, but disconnect from its meaning. You give your time, but expect no thanks. You become efficient at being invisible, so efficient that even you start to forget what it feels like to be seen. But beneath that invisibility is not weakness, it's restraint. It's a power that was never invited to speak, but never stopped watching. It's awareness built from years of observing what others missed. It's a library of skills built without instruction. It's a patience that doesn't come from passivity, but from endurance. You begin to realize that what they mistook for silence was wisdom waiting for the right moment. This history of being overlooked often begins at home, in childhood, in dynamics where louder siblings took up space, where praise was reserved for certain traits, charm, ambition, confidence, and you were praised only for being low-maintenance, where attention was finite, and you learned not to compete for it, where being good meant not needing anything, where love felt conditional on how easy you were to manage. From there, the pattern repeated itself in other spaces. In classrooms, where teachers praised participation over depth. In workplaces where visibility mattered more than value. In friendships where your support was constant but unnoticed. In every environment where the loudest voice was given the most room, and those who carried the weight in silence were taken for granted. In all of these places, you learn to survive by minimizing your needs. But survival isn't the same as belonging. Survival is about staying quiet enough to be tolerated. Belonging is about being seen and valued. And somewhere deep down, you knew the difference. You felt it in the fatigue after every meeting where your insights were skipped. You felt it in the tension after every family gathering where your presence was an afterthought. You felt it in the loneliness of always showing up for others while wondering if anyone would ever show up for you. The history of being overlooked isn't just about what others did, it's also about what you internalized. You began to believe that maybe they were right. That maybe you weren't leader material. That maybe your ideas weren't sharp enough. That maybe you didn't belong at the front. That maybe your job was to support, not to shine. And so you edited yourself, bit by bit, until the person in the mirror felt more like a version of who they needed, not who you truly were. But then, something begins to shift. Not through an external event, but through the slow accumulation of clarity. You start to trace the pattern. You start to name the silences. You start to feel the anger not as a threat, but as evidence that you were never actually content with being minimized. That the discomfort you felt wasn't weakness. It was your integrity pushing back. That the sadness you carried wasn't about being sensitive, it was about having depth in a world that often doesn't reward it. This realization doesn't arrive with drama, it arrives with precision. You start to remember your contributions in full detail. You recall the projects you held together, the people you quietly mentored, the deadlines you saved, the emotional labor you carried without question. You see the invisible fingerprints you left on everything, and you start to feel something unfamiliar. Pride, not boastful, but rightful. Not loud, but rooted. The history doesn't erase itself. But you stop carrying it as shame. You start carrying it as evidence, proof that you have endured, that you have risen, that you have become someone strong, not in spite of being overlooked, but because of it. Because in the absence of recognition, you learned how to recognize yourself. In the absence of praise, you learned how to refine your voice. In the absence of space, you learned how to create your own. You begin to understand that being overlooked isn't the same as being unqualified, that being dismissed doesn't mean you don't have value, that being quiet doesn't mean you lack clarity, that the world's inability to see your worth does not make you invisible, it makes them blind. From this place, a new kind of confidence begins to grow, not the kind that seeks approval, but the kind that stands without needing it. A quiet, grounded self-assurance that says, I know what I've done, I know what I carry, I know what I've built, and whether or not you choose to see it, it exists. I exist, and I no longer need your acknowledgement to validate what I already know to be true. This is where the story turns. Where the history of being overlooked becomes the fuel for something greater. Not revenge, but revelation. Not resentment, but redefinition. You begin to rise, not above them, but into yourself. Fully, finally, fiercely. There comes a point in every overlooked story where silence can no longer disguise significance. A moment when the weight of what's been carried in the shadows becomes too heavy to stay hidden. The truth, long buried beneath assumptions and biases, begins to surface, not because someone finally listens, but because the evidence becomes too overwhelming to ignore. Recognition does not arrive as a gift. It arrives as a reckoning. Truth does not need to be defended when it becomes undeniable. It simply exists, tall and unshakable. And when it emerges, it does so with quiet force. It doesn't scream for attention. It simply stands still while the noise collapses around it. And in that stillness, people finally begin to notice what was always there. The steady presence, the precise contribution, the work they never asked about but always benefited from. The moment the truth emerged was not a performance. It was not dramatized. It was a natural unfolding of accountability. The systems began to bend. The gaps became too large to fill without the person they had once dismissed. The business began to lean heavily on the very structures that were built by hands no one credited. The missing pieces were traced back to the one they had consistently overlooked, and suddenly, the silence was replaced with questions. It is strange how people react when the invisible becomes essential. Some are shocked, others are embarrassed. Most try to reframe the story, as if rewriting their version will absolve them of having missed it the first time. But the truth does not ask for explanation. It only reveals what has always been present: the labor, the loyalty, the knowledge, the leadership. There is no longer room to pretend. The truth stands taller than denial. And in that moment, everything changes, not because you speak louder, but because they finally go quiet. They stop talking over you, not out of respect, but because they now realize they don't have the answers. They pause before dismissing you, not out of politeness, but because they can no longer afford to ignore your insight. The same contributions that were once taken for granted now become urgent. The same skills that were minimized are now relied upon. The shift is not vindication, it is revelation. Not in their eyes, but in your own. You realize that you never needed their validation. You never needed a seat at their table, because the table itself could not stand without the structure you quietly maintained beneath it. Your foundation was never decoration. It was always critical. And now, that truth has surfaced, undeniable and untouchable. There is a strange silence that follows truth. A silence filled with glances, with reconsiderations, with subtle shifts in posture. The people who once bypassed you now measure their words. The ones who talked over you now ask you to repeat what you said. The ones who ignored your presence now acknowledge it, not with warmth, but with necessity. They are not giving you your worth. They are simply reacting to a truth they can no longer escape. The moment truth emerged, the dynamics changed. The invisible web of assumptions began to fray. The hierarchy, once unquestioned, began to tilt. The authority of those who had performed competence without delivering results began to look hollow. The power held by those who depended on others' silence started to crack. Because once truth reveals the source, everything else becomes exposed. You didn't change. The room did. You didn't become smarter, more capable, more valuable. You simply became visible. The work you had done quietly for years had always mattered. The impact you made had always been real. The difference was now, it was no longer deniable. And, in that undeniable space, the entire perception of you transformed, not because you demanded it, but because truth did what truth always does. It reset the narrative. There is a quiet pride that comes with that moment, a knowing, a deep calm certainty. You no longer feel the need to explain your path. You no longer seek credit to fill the gaps of worth. You no longer crave the recognition that once felt like justice, because you now understand that being seen is not the goal. Being seen accurately is. And nothing forces accuracy like undeniable truth. You begin to notice how quickly people shift when truth emerges. How the very same voices that once excluded you now speak of inclusion. How the same hands that once closed doors now hold them open. How quickly humility arrives once the mask of superiority falls. But your response is not revenge. It is boundary. It is discernment. It is quiet strength that no longer compromises to fit into spaces that once misjudged you. The moment of truth becomes the mirror. It shows everyone who they really are, not who they claim to be. It reveals who leaned on others while pretending to lead. Who hid behind titles while others did the work. Who depended on your silence while calling themselves visionary. The moment of truth doesn't create conflict. It simply removes illusion. But more than anything, it shows you to yourself. It reflects your resilience, your consistency, your depth. It reminds you that you did not endure in vain, that your patience was not weakness, that your grace was not invisibility, that your contribution was not small, it was simply uncredited. And now that credit has arrived, power doesn't always arrive with thunder. It doesn't always demand a stage or a microphone. Sometimes, it slips in silently, unannounced, uninvited, undeniable. It is not found in shouting, but in stillness. Not in dominance, but in self-awareness. Real power is rarely about controlling others, it's about refusing to be controlled. It is the moment when the inner shift becomes louder than any external noise. It is when you stop asking to be seen and start living in full visibility without anyone's permission. There comes a point where the silence you once tolerated starts to sound like a rejection you can no longer absorb, not because it hurts more, but because you finally feel the weight of how often you made yourself smaller to accommodate it. The tolerance fades. Not with drama, but with clarity. What once felt acceptable becomes unbearable. What once felt like patience is now recognized as self-neglect, and what once looked like humility is now known as suppression. That shift is the beginning of real change, not external, but foundational. A subtle but irreversible redefinition of who you are and how you allow yourself to exist in the world. No announcements are made. No declarations are posted. But internally, the balance of power shifts. What once was suppressed now rises. What once was hidden now steps forward. And what once was doubted now becomes non-negotiable. This is the rebirth of self-respect, the reclamation of voice, the return to center. Change begins with choices. Tiny ones. The choice to stop justifying your value. The choice to stop explaining your presence. The choice to stop entering rooms apologetically. The choice to answer with certainty instead of deferring to others. The choice to speak when silence would be easier. The choice to stop agreeing just to keep the peace. Each decision reinforces something stronger than pride. It reinforces identity. It reinforces the truth that you were never lacking, only overlooked. That your presence was never accidental, only inconvenient for those who needed you to stay small. That your strength was never absent, only hidden behind the need to be digestible. Power begins in how you walk into your own spaces. It lives in your posture, your decisions, your tone. It's in how you hold eye contact. How you stop explaining your past. How you stop shrinking from the discomfort of others who can no longer control your narrative. It is how you stay silent when others expect you to plead your case. How you no longer flinch when they try to reclaim the version of you that made them feel superior. Quiet power does not seek revenge. It doesn't require retaliation. It doesn't need validation from the ones who failed to see you, because the change isn't about them, it's about the life you build when you stop waiting for someone else to tell you you're allowed to take up space. Loud change is not about decibels. It's about presence. The unmissable presence of someone who has returned to themselves. The undeniable truth of someone who no longer asks for acceptance. The final, sacred acceptance of one's own worth, without condition, without delay, without dilution, and the external world responds, not because you forced it, but because energy never lies. People start listening more closely, not because your words changed, but because your energy did. They start asking for your input differently, not because you became louder, but because you stopped asking to be included. They see you differently because you are no longer waiting to be seen. You are visible, not because they finally turned toward you, but because you stopped dimming your light. Suddenly, the story changes, the roles shift, the dynamics adjust. The same people who once looked past you now pause before they speak. The same ones who placed you in the back room now measure their words. Not because they've changed, but because you have. You are no longer easy to underestimate. You are no longer willing to be reduced. You are no longer available for conversations that center someone else's comfort over your dignity. Loud change ripples outward. It alters expectations. It disturbs unspoken agreements that were never fair to begin with. It draws lines that cannot be erased. And it does all of this without needing to dominate, without needing to humiliate. It holds its own space, peacefully and powerfully. That kind of shift doesn't just restore balance, it creates it. It restores your time, your voice, your autonomy. It reclaims the hours lost in second-guessing. It rebuilds the confidence eroded by years of being undervalued. It reminds you that you were never behind, you were just waiting to stop handing out permission slips for your own success. Quiet power builds new rhythms. You stop rushing. You stop overworking to prove something. You stop giving answers to questions no one asked. You stop over-explaining decisions you know are right for you. You work differently. You rest without guilt. You show up when you're ready, not when others expect you to. And with this shift, your standards evolve, not in a defensive way, but in a rooted one. You no longer tolerate indirect disrespect. You no longer excuse inconsistency. You no longer offer proximity to people who cannot hold space for your wholeness. You no longer confuse politeness with partnership. You no longer romanticize potential. You see clearly now who adds value, who drains it, who matches your energy, who subtracts from it. The change shows up in your boundaries, not as walls, but as invitations. Invitations to relationships based on mutuality, to conversations built on truth, to partnerships grounded in respect. You no longer bend for people who won't stretch for you. You no longer explain your no. You no longer apologize for needing peace. This transformation, while quiet, echoes in every corner of your life. It strengthens your presence in rooms where you were once dismissed. It softens your reactions to people who once had power over you. It grounds your purpose in something deeper than approval. It elevates your vision beyond what others can see. You stop reacting to ignorance. You stop chasing clarity from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop waiting for permission to pivot, to walk away, to lead, to build. You move, you create, you become the proof, not of revenge, but of resilience, not of ego, but of evolution. The loudest change happens when you are no longer triggered by things that once dismantled you. When the people who once wounded you now pass by your life like background noise. When your old fears dissolve under the weight of your new self-trust. When your inner compass becomes more accurate than anyone's opinion. This is the season of restoration, of deep repair, of unapologetic elevation. You no longer ask if you're allowed to rise. You rise because you finally understand that nothing about you was ever the problem. The silence, the dismissal, the exclusion, those were reflections of other people's limitations, not your lack of value. Now, the table you once begged to sit at no longer feels like the goal. You're building your own. With intention, with depth, with seats for those who don't need to be convinced of your worth. The storage room. It becomes a story. Not of shame, but of beginning. The place you were placed, before you remembered who you were. Your rise is quiet, but it speaks volumes. And the world hears it, even the ones who once refused to listen.